The World's Fair Podcast, number 18. In this episode, we present in its entirety a panel discussion held on September 15th in St. Louis entitled Expo 2020, The Return of a World's Fair in the United States. Hello there, this is episode 18 of the World's Fair Podcast. This is Urso Chappell from ExpoMuseum.com. This episode, we do not have John on the line with us because basically we're just going to replay a panel discussion that was held in St. Louis on September the 15th. I was honored to be asked to be on a panel discussion about the possibility of a World's Fair in the United States in 2020. That was held during the International Festival and Events Association convention that was in St. Louis this year. In attendance, in addition to myself, was Barry Howard, who many Expo people might know. He's created 16 Expo pavilions, both here in the United States and abroad, and he's been on the Creative Council to 3 World's Fair organizing committees or their management organizations. And his office served as the theme consultant to Expo 67 in Montreal. He also worked on the American Freedom Train Bicentennial in 1976, and then he also worked on the 1984 World's Fair in New Orleans. He then later on served as a development counsel for the New South Wales celebration at the 1988 Australian Bicentenary. Also, you'll hear Steve Heckler, who's based in the Minneapolis-St. Paul, and he's been in the event business for over 30 years. He's the director of the Festival of Nations there, and just recently got interested in World's Fairs, and he attended the 1964-65 New York World's Fair that was in Flushing Meadows in Queens, New York, as well as Expo 67. Also, as part of the panel, is John Hottinger, who was in the Minnesota Senate from 1991 to 2002, and then later from 2003 to 2006. So without further ado, I present to you the entire panel discussion as it was held in St. Louis, Missouri. The first voice you'll hear is that of Steve Heckler.
I will start basically about a year, maybe more than that, about a year ago. I began to get an interest in a World Expo coming back to the United States. For the last 5 years, I've been director of Festival of Nations, which is a large multicultural event, and it seemed like a natural progression to look into this. Little did I know how much involvement there is to even consider and where to move from this. And so as I started researching this a little bit, finding out how you would move, I discovered Mr. Urso Chappell's website, and we'll introduce everybody here, who started the U.S. Expo. Was that the name of the site exactly?
ExpoMuseum.com.
ExpoMuseum.
Yeah, and then later the Expo 2020 USA.com.
Correct. So Urso's from San Francisco, the Bay Area, and it put together a informational website about 10 years ago. It started?
12 years ago.
12 years, okay. Anyway, that was a place to start, and that's where things are going. So anyway, from that experience, we were trying to see what it would take to bring a World's Fair back to the United States. And I brought in some fantastic folks to talk to. And also John Hottinger from Minnesota. You probably know John. He was a state legislator for, 12 years?
16.
16. I'm off.
I remember vividly.
Remember every moment, don't you?
Yes, exactly.
So
I remember the 4 years since better, though.
And so what I'll start, I'm going to turn it over to Urso, and I'll let you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and we'll introduce. Basically, Urso, I was going to describe what a World's Fair is, kind of an overview, just give you an idea and a concept of what the whole procedure is.
So when I've talked to different audiences, different people seem to know different things about World's Fairs, and I'm going to reveal my age. I'm 43 years old, and whenever I talk to anyone who's older than me, I always get the same reaction that World's Fairs, they still go on, and then when I talk to anyone who's younger than me, they just go, World's Fairs, what's that? So we have, many times when I've talked to people, there's been a sort of education gap. So tried to sort of put together a sort of brief sort of history of how we've gotten from 1851 up till now, and what's planned for now up until 2015. So I think most people in this audience, festival people, would know that it's a public event consisting of exhibits from multiple nations. What you might not know is that they started in 1851 in London, and Prince Albert created what's generally considered to be the first World's Fair in 1851. And along with the Olympics and the World Cup, they're sort of the three sort of big events, big international events that happen. As we're talking today, you'll probably hear us say World's Fair, World Expo, Expo, International Exposition, and the nomenclature can be kind of confusing, but basically they're all the same thing. Mostly in the United States, we tend to use the term World's Fair. In other countries, it tends to be Expo. It just has to do with mostly the marketing of any individual World's Fair and who they're talking to. But generally, they all mean the same thing. Now, the last one in North America was Expo 86 in Vancouver, which is why whenever I talk to anyone who's younger than me, they don't know what a World's Fair is. And then the last one in the United States was in 1984 in New Orleans. And we'll probably talk a little bit about the 84 and the 86 experiences, one which is a little better than the other as far as the results and financially. Currently, you can tell I created this PowerPoint before May because we're currently in Expo 2010, which is in Shanghai. And as I go through some of the more recent ones, I'll have some photos from that. And there's the current schedule for World's Fairs as they're set up by the BIE, which is the Bureau International des Expositions, which is the organizing body, is that we have like a big one every 5 years, which is sort of the short way of saying it, with a sort of small one in between. And the analogy I kind of like to think of is they're kind of like Summer Olympics and Winter Olympics. I don't know if you have the sort of same impression of them, but it's a good way to sort of think about them. And starting with the year 2000, they've set up a schedule that they're every 5 years, 2000, 2005, 2015, and then 2020, and then they allow for one of the smaller ones in between. So after 2010 in Shanghai and after 2015 in Milan, the next big slot is 2020. So up until World War II, you probably have heard of like several events that are World's Fairs. Not everyone always necessarily remembers them, that they are World's Fairs. But you have the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, and then the several Expositions Universelles in Paris. Probably the most famous one, 1889, when they had built the Eiffel Tower for the first time. And then it was reused in 1900 and 1937. Probably everyone here is familiar with the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. That's really well known in the U.S. Here in St. Louis, in what's now Forest Park, was the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition, which until this year had the record for being the largest in area. It was a little over 1,000 acres. In San Francisco, where I live, we've held the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. And then people might also be familiar with the Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago and the New York World's Fair in 1939. And then sort of like the Olympics, there's a huge gap during World War II. And then you sort of jump to 1958, which I'll get to. I like to... Many times people will say, well, aren't World's Fairs obsolete? Why do we still have World's Fairs? And I was recently reading a book that just came out last year about the history of the Eiffel Tower. And it was interesting that in the 1880s, when they were planning the Eiffel Tower, there were a lot of people saying, World's Fairs, aren't they really obsolete in the 1880s? Why do we still have them? And so the history of World's Fairs to me are kind of a history of them sort of being declared obsolete, and to me, World's Fairs are a medium, just like other kind of mediums. Obviously, they're very similar to the Olympic Games. They're similar to theme parks. They're similar to museums. Obviously they're festivals, and they're like live entertainment. And we certainly wouldn't say the Olympic Games are obsolete. We certainly wouldn't say that theme parks are obsolete. When people say, well, we don't need World's Fairs, we have the internet. And it's like, well, we don't need theme parks, we have the internet. So next time your kid wants to go to Disneyland, just tell them you'll take them to the Disneyland website and see how far you get. Every museum in the world has like their whole collections on the internet, but yet people still go to museums. There's something about being there in person, and with World's Fairs, it's much the same way. Just being there in person and the experience is a great deal of what it is. And you on the internet, you don't get to have that sort of person-to-person meeting aspect that is one of the more rewarding things, at least that I've found in the 8 World's Fairs that I've been to so far. So just to sort of bring us up from World War II up to now, the first World's Fair after World War II is Expo 58, which was held in Brussels. And if people are familiar with Brussels, they probably know the Atomium, which is one of the legacy structures from Expo 58. And people probably also familiar with the Space Needle in Seattle, which is one of the legacies of the Seattle World's Fair in 1862. And Key Arena is also left over from that, and the what's now the Pacific Science Center started out as the United States Pavilion, yeah. It was the U.S. Science Pavilion, and the monorail is still left over from that as well. And that whole area is still a tourist draw, and people still go there to sort of seek out the World's Fair, even though it's been decades since it was held. A lot of Americans also are familiar with the 1964-65 New York World's Fair, which was held in Flushing Meadows at the same site as the 39-40 World's Fair. And there's a few legacy buildings left over from that, including the Unisphere, which people who watched Men in Black will probably recognize. And the New York State Pavilion was exploded in that movie, but lives on in reality.
Imploded.
You think it should be imploded at the time?
Absolutely.
And Expo 67 in Montreal is also another good example of post uses of expos.